Rabbi, good morning. It's so great to see you.
Hi, how you doing, Isaac?
Doing well, doing well,
Okay,
Rabbi.
so we finished the Sermon on the Mount, but we're finishing chapter 7.
That's right.
Another equally good, amazing accomplishment.
Mhm. And this is a big milestone. I can't believe this. We're almost at the
Chapter
last,
7, I feel like we should look back and see when we started chapter 7. It was
probably,
probably a year and a half ago.
probably 2 years ago.
It's hard to believe. Okay, let's hear it.
Well, on that note, the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 7, verse 28 onwards. When Jesus finished these teachings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as his scribes.
Wow, there's so much to talk about here. And I'll just throw out the three main questions and then we could discuss. So why were the crowds astonished? So it seems that they've heard many times people speak, but Jesus qualitatively must have been special, must have been different in a way that the New Testament, that right here, Matthew in verse 29 tries to pinpoint. How is he different? He taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. So we'll talk about what scribes, Pharisees are today, but there are people who taught them all the time, who went to their synagogues on the Sabbath, who taught them on mountains before. I'm sure he wasn't the first one. And then they taught, and when these scribes taught, they said whatever they said, and the people were not astonished. They were not astonished either because they heard it before. They're not astonished because it wasn't innovative. Maybe it wasn't subversive. Maybe it wasn't something that was hermeneutically amazing. And then Jesus came along. It did something that was absolutely astonishing, something that they had not heard before. So I thought when I first read the verse 28, I was gonna say he taught in a subversive way. He taught teachings that they didn't hear before. He taught all this new stuff. But what does it say instead? It says he taught as one having authority.
Authority, yeah.
Okay, so our question for you is, Isaac, what was for you? So you just finished the last year and a half, you went over the Sermon on the Mount. You were able to witness firsthand astonishment of
Hmm.
what he said.
Hmm.
So I'll be honest, I'm looking at this, and to me, I was able to feel in its cultural context, in its first century Jewish context, and it fits. It was in conversation with it. It was something that made sense to me. I'd love to hear, Isaac. You read this. Is this something you find astonishing? Is this something that you would, if you were a first century listener
Yeah.
on in the Galilee, hearing this Sermon on the Mount, would you have been astonished to hear what this is? Because you, Isaac, you've really heard this in contradistinction to what the scribes say.
Yeah.
You've heard the astonishments.
Yeah. It's Rabbi, it's a great question. I think here's how, if I was first century, here's how I would have said, this guy is crazy. What's he really talking about? And but the point is he speaks with confidence. He's able to say a coherent, at least I would have said he comes with a coherent story, but so many of the things he says are extravagant, are outrageous. They don't even have any bearing on reality. And so I want to say maybe I want to listen to him because what he's saying is so far removed. He's speaking of this complete different world. So I've reflected on the word authority, and so I do not know. Again, I do not know what this would have meant. But what I know is that he speaks with confidence. He's very articulate. He's able to get his point across. To your point, maybe we could say it's subversive, it's innovative, where he's able to take his ideas, concepts, and be able to express that in a way which gets his point across.
I
But
love how you, but Isaac, let's be honest. I assume he's speaking of confidence. I hear that, but there's nothing like in the text that like it never said Jesus spoke with confidence. And if anything, let's remember Moses spoke with Aros Osaim, a circumcised lip, probably means a stutter, and people would say he didn't speak with confidence, and that wasn't inherently a problem. He had
Mhm.
Aaron at his side. So it's interesting. The main thing that you're hearing out of this is something that I'd say is not really there. He spoke of confidence. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he did. Maybe it took him a couple weeks to say it over, or maybe he said it in 10 minutes. But it's funny how like the main thing that you're superimposing upon the text is the thing that you're like, wow, I don't think it's there really. Am I wrong? I mean, he said a lot of interesting things, and other rabbis, scholars, Pharisees, scribes would have said interesting things too. But I wouldn't say that's confidence. I would say to me that's innovative. I would say that that's creative. I'd say maybe it's ingenious. But I'm not sure I would use the word courage.
That's interesting. So when I think of Moses, right? So Moses, as you said, he had a stutter or he couldn't speak eloquently. Moses was a great leader. He led people. he didn't quite, again, but his way of expressing was not so much as in reframing the question. It was more as in pointing them in a certain way. Right? And so, but when I look at Jesus, he didn't quite he didn't lead them from, I mean, at least physically, didn't lead them from one place to another. It's more as in opening their eyes to see things differently. As in, I look at his teachings as more in terms of enlightenment, at least the Sermon on the Mount, where it does impact how we think, and that thinking impacts behavior. And to be able to articulate that in a way, to be able to, when I mean confidence, not being socially confident, but having confidence in what he's saying, or having that
And again,
confidence
and he's speaking in a
in his belief
way,
system. Yeah.
when he speaks about divorce, and when he speaks about the other kind of commandments, where he says, this is how everyone else prays, but this is how I say you should pray. When he says, this is how everyone else judges, this is how I think you should judge. He definitely, it's a mix between parables and super arrogative legalisms, which we don't know if are metaphors or literal. But he's definitely speaking in a way that is, I guess we say courageous, as you said. It's speaking in a way that would, again, like I would use innovative. We our favorite word, subversive, different. And I think when people speak differently, there's one of two reactions, right? One is like, heretic, you're horrible, let's kill him. Which this might be a little foreshadowing for the end of Matthew. I'm not gonna tell you what happens, but we'll see. But another way is that, wow, this person has such genius, has such courageousness and connection to God, that they're able to speak a higher level truth. A lot of times, when in Jewish history, when we look at 17th and late 16th century 17th century mysticisms, we look at, it's really a movement. The Kabbalah that came about was a movement that really didn't have its roots in what people said before, but people looked at the holiness of the rabbi. They looked at these rabbis, and then they thought, like, this guy is obviously not a charlatan. This is a person who embodies God. When you speak to him, when you see him, you see how he's such a charismatic leader. You see he lives a life of holiness. It must be what he's saying is true. So I feel that that charismatic leader model that we see in Judaism by the famous Kabbalists of the 16th and 17th century maybe is something that we see here, that there's a level that they went beyond. They created almost a religion on top of the religion, and that where they were respected for doing that, and they eventually became integrated. I mean, obviously, Christianity was bifurcated and broke off into its own religion, and it didn't integrate. But the last time in Judaism where you really see this integration, and I'll be honest, and then once you get to 18th and 19th century, you get Hasidim, and they also have a level of Judaism that's different, and it gets integrated. So the question is Jesus just one of those iterations of these people who seem holy, who seem exceptional, who seem courageous, who seem ingenious, who seem innovative, and they are so strong that they just impact the religion and move it a little bit in a different direction. But his impact was so strong, based on the vicissitudes of history, that it changed into another religion.
So could this also mean that, what this is alluding to is that he had a firm grasp on scriptures in a way the scribes
I hope so. I mean, listen,
in his time, the scribes in his time didn't have, because it takes, again, Judaism has been there for a while, it's not new at that time. And he had a much firmer grasp of what the scriptures meant.
So how would we evaluate that? We wouldn't be able to, the only thing I could tell you is that we have many times that the Gospels will interpret text from the Old Testament, from the Bible. And I'll tell you, like, when I view it, and I think we spoke as many times, I think there's maybe 7 specific Matthew quotes where the evangelist is actually using his own hermeneutic license in order to interpret text. It's creative. It's definitely something that, Nazarite, where in Hebrew it's a Z versus a tsa. It's like pizza versus, but he uses it. So the hermeneutic license is there. And if anything, we see Jesus, the way I see him, is more as a preacher, more than a exegete. So, when we look at the famous medieval Jewish exegetes of Rashi, or Ibn Ezra, or Ramban, or Rashbam, or Radak, like, we see these people are interpreting text. So I feel like no one looks at Jesus and say he's an exegete. They'll say he's a magic worker. They'll say he's a miracle worker. They'll say he's a charismatic leader. They'll say, if you're Christian, you'll say he's met a Messiah. But generally, exegete is not on the list Story, so this is something that is, who is the real Jesus? It's something that to think about.
So,
Um,
so
yeah.
okay, this topic of his authority and how he came across. Then there's the question of people were astonished. When I mean astonished, right? They were just taken back, and I go, you cannot have a better response than being astonished, because that's how I feel about it. At least I
Okay,
feel
but
about it.
astonished, what does astonished mean? Astonished for, I think it means astonished for good, don't get me wrong, but I'm astonished by how crazy, how stupid, how off the mark some people are. But it sounds like it sounds like they're in the middle a little bit. They're
Yeah, fair
astonished
enough.
that
Yeah,
he was so different. And when you
that's
hear
right.
so different, that is not automatically a praise. And again, like I feel like it's meant 100% as praise in Matthew. And I think anyone who reads it as not as praise is misreading this. But I feel like,
Again, so let's face it, right? Matthew it's a very difficult book. Some of the things he speaks are very, very harsh. And so astonishment is the appropriate response to your point. It could be astonishment as in, does this guy know what he's talking? Or it could also be astonishment as in, wow, this does seem
right.
something. So we don't
Okay,
quite know.
but again, like
It's vague. It's
I'll
vague.
accept that the astonishment is good. Okay,
It's
but
vague, right? And this would be the appropriate response, just given how harsh this book can be, some of these teachings can be, and so completely sometimes far removed. It might come across as being far removed from
yeah,
reality. So it does.
okay,
I'm not entirely surprised that they were astonished. I would probably be in the same boat as them, as astonished as in, probably with the level of doubt, as in, what is this person really saying? But
yeah, okay. So Isaac, what I want to do today is multifaceted. So we don't always talk about the nature of narrative, and that's why I want to a little bit talk today. I want to give you I know we almost always focus on Old Testament quotes, but I'm not gonna do that today. We're gonna have some more gospel type quotes. And I just want to compare this, what we just read to something in Mark and something in Luke. And I want to see how you take it. So what we just read, just repeat now, when Jesus had finished these things, the crowds were astonished. He taught them having authority, not as the scribes. So we see in Mark 121, we see that they Mark 121 to 22, they went down to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he, namely Jesus, entered the synagogue and taught. And then next verse 22 says, they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. Okay, so this is a different place. He's speaking in Capernaum. He's speaking on the Sabbath, and he's speaking probably somewhat from the pulpit or whatever it meant back then. And then we have verse 22 of Mark almost identically parallels verses roughly, verses 28 and 29 from Matthew. And then we see in Luke 4:31 to 4:32, we see he, namely again Jesus, went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astonished at his teaching because he spoke with authority. So where Mark is right in the beginning in 122, Luke is already in chapter 4, and we have this identical line. So I'm going to take a step back and say, I'm the editor. I got a bunch of teachings from Jesus, and there's certain editorial kind of lines. Let me give you two examples of editorial lines. One example is he teaches with authority, not as the scribes. That's a line I'm going to use. Let me give you another line. Also here, it says when Jesus had finished saying these things. This phrase, when Jesus had finished saying these things, shows up so many times. In Matthew alone, it shows up 11:1, 13:53, 19:1, 26:1. So in other words, this is an editorial note that there's no one at the time Jesus had finished saying these things. This is something that takes place after, when you're recording, you write these kind of things. So in other words, these two lines are of Matthew 28 and 29 are editor notes. And these editor notes, in the first one shows up in Mark and Luke, and the second one, not only does it show up in, as I showed you Matthew multiple times, but even there's actually it's a common phrase that you see in the Chumash, in the Old Testament. You have a phrase, for example, in Numbers 16:20, 36, chapter 16. It says, when Moses finished saying these things, and that's a story of Korach, the ground opened up, and that was just a narrative. But we actually see, which I think is really interesting, in Deuteronomy 32:45, it said when Moses finished reciting all these things to Israel, and then he goes on and gives like kind of another speech. So in Deuteronomy 32:45, this is a technical, also editor's note, that this is the end of that speech. So I'd love to hear, I'm not so worried about the Pentateuch and how they use editor's notes, but I feel like we have a situation here that has to be addressed, right? We have a situation where the editor is coming along and is happy to say he taught the crowds in their astonished teachings. They maybe were astonished in both situations, but it looks like it's an editor note. And also that this is also when he finished teaching, also editor's note. So I think this opens the question, what I want to open to you. We discussed a couple times. What is the editor, the person who wrote down Mark, Matthew, Luke, trying to accomplish? And before you answer, I want to give you some options. Because in Judaism at that time, we have oral law. They could have just said this is staying oral forever, and Christians just had to memorize it, and it happens. But they decided already in the end of some point in the second half of the first century, that they're going to write this down. The evangelists are going to have this, and there'll be different versions, and they'll work it out. And they're not even going to make Mark and Matthew and Luke all be one. Even this one line where it says he went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and the other one in Mark, it says in Capernaum. The implication is everyone in Mark knows where Capernaum is, and everyone in Luke maybe doesn't know where Capernaum is, but it's really the same exact line. So what are our options? So one option, why does the editor write this? He just wants to record the teachings of Jesus. Another option, he wants to teach people to believe in Jesus, not only record it for historical reasons, but wants it to be taught so people believe. Another option is he's trying to create the best narrative that would be impactful to the people. I told you multiple times how the rabbis of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth century are rabbinic storytellers, and how we're able to see very, very easily that the same story will show up just like in the Gospels, in the Tosefta, in the Mishnah, in the Babylon Talmud and in the Jerusalem Talmud, and we'll see different facts, just like we see in the Synoptics. So Isaac, what are you supposed to do with this as a good believing Christian, where you see the same line shows up in different places, and it probably is an editor's note?
I think it's option 3. It's the editor's note for folks to put Jesus the best light possible, and he wanted to show that his words had were final, that it had authority, and it meant something. And so I would take option 3 of the three you mentioned.
Okay, listen, there's no right or wrong answer, but it's something that I think we have to note that, I think, there's a lot of books on the historical Jesus. And I think the reason that we have books on the historical Jesus, what can you know? And some people say a lot, some people say a little. I think because of lines like this. I think this kind of leads us to think like, well, I don't know if the evangelist is a reliable storyteller of the historical narrative when I know he has certain phrases that he superimposes upon the text from time to time. A reliable storyteller would rather have a bad story than a well-written story.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah. So I think when we see the end of the sermon and we see like this, it's such clear editorial work. It's something that we have to worry about.
So you make a great point. What you're saying is, if you see this clear editorial note, are there any implications for the verses which the preceding verses as said? Now, if this note was made by the editor, or this was placed by the editor to highlight something, how much of what we looked into earlier was also modified, or was shaped, or was embellished, or updated, or changed, whatever you want to call it, to reflect, to convey the.
And I'll be honest, Isaac, there's actually two kinds of editorial notes. One editorial that both happen in these lines in Matthew. One is he finished speaking. That kind of editorial note, this observation is true in thousands of instances. He's finished speaking. Right when we're done finished speaking, if an editor came along and wrote he finished speaking, that would be accurate 10,000 times. But the crowds were astounded at his teaching as he spoke as one of authority and not as their scribes. I mean, that is a somewhat abstract point. It's almost like a news journalist. He's like trying to evaluate the feel of the people. It's not an easy thing to kind of grasp, but so he feels. But if he writes it at different on the end of different kind of tales, it undermines a list, or at least it weakens or lessens our believability that they were so astounded.
So, okay, now I would give the other perspective, right? So what's wrong with this editorial note? I mean, again, this is not meant to be, it was not meant to be autobiographical. It was meant to convey a point. So things have been, human beings paraphrase all the time. It's not meant to say, it's not meant to quote exact single word by word, like the exact word they said. And so so again, and in terms, so I don't see yes, they added that and an editorial note. It doesn't diminish or doesn't change
Well,
what's
they're just
come
again
before.
the issue is that the one on authority and now Scribes they put it in Mark at the end of a different speech he gave. If you could have multiple times. Okay. Anyway,
But
so
but these things, no, it's so broad, it's so generic, right? He teaching his authority, not his scribes. Like one could apply this at any place, and it'll probably fit exactly in any place, just because some of these teachings are so far are so far.
100%, 100%.
So I don't. So I'm not quite tracking as in, given how broad these statements are, it's so broad, so generic. Yeah, he spoke with authority and not as a scribes. It could probably fit
I
in
guess
any place.
I guess like maybe just try to phrase it a different way. So we noted some places, at least I believe, that even in Matthew, it's coming down from different sources,
Mhm.
and not even the Q source. So over here, if you imagine that some of these teachings, even if they're written down, there's a person who's redacting and
Mhm.
collecting,
Mhm.
and some of them might have been oral teachings, but this redactor, editor, evangelist, writer, editor, whatever you want to call this person, when they get these things, they kind of have to make it make sense. And the fact that they probably got this like one line saying he taught with, and they when Mark they stuck it here, and Matthew stuck it here. So it seems to me, it more again, you're kind of arguing or maintaining that he was such an innovative teacher. They could have been astonished by his authority in multiple times, and he could have spoke as not as one of the scribes multiple times, and that is 100% true. But another option is that when they were kind of collecting, redacting, editing all these pieces of paper or all these oral teachings, they had to stick it somewhere. And when Matthew wrote it, like the most meaningful thing for many people is the Sermon on the Mount. So if you're going to take this piece and take that piece, you would put it right there. That's the
Mhm.
logical place. But for Matthew, that doesn't really have sorry, for Mark, that really doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount at all.
Mhm. I think,
Most
yeah.
of the parallels to the Sermon on the Mount, as we noted, are almost exclusively in Luke. So when Matthew wanted to almost like frame it, Matthew happens in the first chapter, 121, when they went to Capernaum. It's almost like this frames Jesus's career. He
Mhm.
speaks as someone where for Matthew, it's kind of saying these teachings are the 10 commandments of teachings. These are the things that are astonishing. So I would view it more and from that perspective than your perspective.
So okay, so Rabbi, here's how I also view this, right? So where at the end of this, he does not say people believe this wholeheartedly, right? Verse 28 says it's so vague, as in he also is kind of alluding to something else. It feels like by saying he said this thing, people were astonished, and that is, it's kind of in between. It's not clear. There could be astonishment by wow, astonishment, this is crazy, um, and I find that a bit surprising, because if as described for this, okay, he did not flat out can't say people loved him or they absolutely adored it. He left room for other associates of, there could have been doubt, there could have been these things. Um, and so when he spoke as authority and not as scribes, into your point, they just they probably plug this from here to there. But there's also a bit of a disconnect, right? As in, he spoke with authority, and the editor thinks that he is Messiah, God, Lord, and all these things. But the response to the crowd, he also leaves space for human astonishment, as in, um, you know, because, do you see a point in that, a question in that, a comment in that? Because the topic of him having authority, he didn't apply this. It did not apply to the crowds or to their response or how they thought about it. Yes, he had authority, and yes, the folks there, they were astonished, which is also very vague. Which on the face of it, they may seem so contradictory, as in, if one had authority, then people would bow down or do certain things, but saying, yeah, he had authority, but the crowds, they were
Yeah,
just
you're saying we don't know what they did with that authority. It's an
right.
ambiguity.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and we spoke about rabbinic authority, and when we spoke about Lord, We spoke about like what it means to follow an authority, and it could be that we should understand that perspective. But again, like the idea of authority is definitely ambiguous, and what does it mean to follow someone? I'll be honest. So maybe this is a good transition to our second and last topic, is what is a scribe? So a lot of times, the first thing to note is that there's a lot of literature in the Christian community about what a scribe is. In Jewish tradition, it was like generally pretty clear. There's actually certain names that we give people, and you may not know. It's like I generally, when I say Moses in Hebrew, I don't say Moses. I say
Moshe.
Moshe Rabbeinu. It means
Okay.
Moses, a teacher. And I say Abraham. I don't say Abraham. I say Avram Avinu, Abraham, our father.
So
And
do
when
I
I say
call you
Yosef,
do I call you Russ Rabino? Like
no, no,
what
no.
do I call you then?
Yeah, Russ is fine. But so a lot of people have an additional name like attached to them, like Joseph, we say Yosef Atzadik, Yosef the righteous. So one of the most famous ones, and he's the only one I think of that, is Ezra. Ezra is the person who during the beginning of the second Commonwealth returned from Babylon to help the process of stopping assimilation and intermarriage and helping to build the second temple. So Ezra, he's called Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe. So no one knows why someone's called a scribe. There's different possibilities. So one is that he's someone who physically writes the Torah. He's a scribe. Another thing, he's someone who interprets the Torah. Is almost like a head rabbi kind of perspective. What we see in the New Testament is that it says scribe here, but it does say scribe and Pharisees in certain texts, like the Syriac text says scribe and Pharisees, and other places. For example, in 23:2, we see it says scribes and Pharisees. So some people want to say when it says scribes and Pharisees, it means that scribes are Pharisees.
Mhm.
Other people want to say, well, it says Kai, it says and in Greek. Like if I say Isaac and Russ, that means Isaac is not Russ. It means A and B, not A and A. The very fact that you write scribes and Pharisees, it means that they are two different groups completely. What's interesting is that I think a lot of times when I think of scribes in this context, I think of people who have the ability to make hermeneutic decisions, to take what we say in Hebrew a drush, an exposition. And we think of people who are able to take the Bible and expound it in ways away from its original intention. And over here, I think that really fits in with authority, what it means. So over here, what I would translate this, and this is maybe will help with authority. He taught them as one having authority, not as their scribes. Their scribes use their own hermeneutic license to be an exegete in a way to interpret the Bible as he saw fit, but he used a completely different hermeneutic license, especially when we think about different examples of judging and divorce and other things where he, as we talked about, that he was acting in a super arrogative way in either prayer or charity or fasting. So he was using his own license to show authority that he was interpreting the Bible in his own way. Hillel, who was a contemporary of his, is very famous for his ability to make expositions and use his hermeneutic license. I'll give you one example. Hillel, he would say that he has the ability to even take a regular document, a non-holy document, and take it out of its context to interpret it. So I think that would probably be the way that I would use the word scribe in this sentence. So when it says he taught them as one having authority, and as a scribes, he was able to use his authority in one way. So it's not as their scribes didn't have authority, but as their scribes used a certain authority, and he's using a different authority.
Yeah. So, Rabbi, thank you for that background and for that explanation. Thank you. So, you're saying a scribe is people who are, we ascribe this the special people like the ones you mentioned about Abraham. Like you don't call him Abraham, but you call him Abraham, with rabbi or
So Ezra is the only one who we say Ezra the scribe in English. So he's the only one, but he would have lived hundreds and hundreds of years, like 400 years before this. But they definitely were a group of people, just like most times Pharisees don't like Perishim in Hebrew don't call themselves Pharisees. It's more like almost a negative connotation that Christians superimpose. It's very rare. Mostly Sadducees are the main people who call Pharisees Pharisees, or vice versa. It's usually you only use the word Pharisee in contradistinction to Sadducee. So a scribe, it's very rare that Jews in that time period would call themselves a scribe. for the most part, at least in rabbinic tradition, you call yourself the word rabbi existed. The word hazaken, the elder, was definitely a position that would have been held. Nasi, president, would have been held. Beit Din, the head of the court, would have been held. So these terms are evolving over time. But I think that it's interesting how the New Testament kind of has a little historical snippet that it calls them like the people that they're in conversation with is the scribes. And it's
Right.
interesting, and at least from the Matthew perspective, the people he's speaking to in the Galilee on the Mount, these people would have been, I guess, identified with the scribes, or at least been able to hear those scribes in the past. It's something that they would recognize scribes and say, maybe we're part of that team, maybe we're not.
Mhm. And so, Rabbi, so until you had highlighted this, when I read the word scribes, I implicitly implied scribes and Pharisees, and I didn't quite make the distinction that these are two groups. So, thank you for highlighting that.
Well,
So,
I don't know. This is a good question.
This is some of the biases I think as a Christian having read Paul.
Not being a biased Christian, Isaac.
Some of our biases.
I'll say a biased Jew, though.
So we all have a biases, and so until you called it out, I didn't even think about it. I just implicitly assumed scribes meant Pharisee, but as you mentioned, it's not a Pharisee. It's this ancient term back in the
Like I said, though, like again, like unclear. Is
unclear.
there are people who argue both ways. So it's good to note, like, if you want to take the word seriously, how you should come about coming to that conclusion that they are identical or not. Okay, Isaac, I think we'll call it a day.
Rabbi, on that note, I think we
Okay.
read at the Sermon on the Mount. This is a great milestone. Thank you. Have a great Shabbos.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much. Goodbye.